Not only does the phenomenon of temporality which we have set forth require a more wide-ranging confirmation of its constitutive power, but only thus does this phenomenon itself come to view with regard to the fundamental possibilities of temporalization. We shall briefly call the demonstration of the possibility of the constitution of being of Dasein on the basis of temporality, the temporal interpretation, although this is only a provisional term. Our next task is to go beyond the temporal analysis of the authentic potentiality of being whole of Dasein, and a general characterization of the temporality of care, so that the inauthenticity of Dasein may be made visible in its specific temporality. Temporality first showed itself in anticipatory resoluteness. This anticipatory resoluteness is the authentic mode of disclosedness that, for the most part, maintains itself within the inauthenticity of the entangled self-interpretation of the they. The nature of the temporality of disclosedness in general leads to the temporal understanding of that heedful being in the world closest to us, and thus of the average indifference of Dasein from which the existential analytic first started 24, we call the average kind of being of Dasein, in which it initially and for the most part stays, everydayness. By repeating our earlier analysis, everydayness must be revealed in its temporal meaning, so that the problematic included in temporality may come to light, and the seeming obviousness of our preparatory analyses may disappear completely. Indeed, confirmation is to be found for temporality in all the essential structures of the fundamental constitution of Dasein. Yet this does not lead us to run through our analyses again, superficially and schematically, in the same order of presentation. The course of our temporal analysis has a different direction. It is to make the connection of our earlier reflections clearer, and to remove what is contingent and seemingly arbitrary. However, beyond these necessities of method, there are valid motives in the phenomenon itself that compel us to articulate our analysis in a different way when we repeat it. The ontological structure of the being that I myself in each instance am is centered in the self-constancy of existence. Because the self cannot be conceived either as substance or as subject, but is rather grounded in existence, our analysis of the inauthentic self, the they, was left completely as part of the preparatory interpretation of Dasein 25 now that selfhood has been explicitly taken back into the structure of care, and thus of temporality. The temporal interpretation of self-constancy and the lack of self-constancy acquires an importance of its own. It requires a special thematic development. This not only provides us with the right safeguards against the paralogisms and the ontologically inappropriate question about the being of the I in general, at the same time it provides us, in accordance with its central function, with a more primordial insight into the structure of the temporalizing of temporality. Temporality reveals itself as the historicity of Dasein. The statement that Dasein is historical is confirmed as a fundamental existential and ontological proposition. It is far removed from merely ontically ascertaining the fact that Dasein occurs in a world history. The historicity of Dasein, however, is the ground of a possible historiographical understanding that in its turn harbors the possibility of getting a special grasp of the development of historiography as a science. The temporal interpretation of everydayness and historicity secures the view of primordial time sufficiently to uncover it as the condition of the possibility and necessity of the everyday experience of time. Dasein expends itself primarily for itself as a being that is concerned about its being, whether explicitly or not. Initially and for the most part, care is circumspect taking care. Expending itself for the sake of itself, Dasein uses itself up. Using itself up, Dasein uses itself, that is, its time. Using its time, it reckons with it. Taking care, which is circumspect in reckoning, initially discovers time and develops a measurement of time. Measurement of time is constitutive for being in the world. Measuring its time, the discovering of circumspection which takes care lets what it discovers at hand and objectively present be encountered in time. Interworldly beings thus become accessible as existing in time. We shall call the temporal quality of interworldly beings within timeness. The time, initially found therein ontically, becomes the basis for the development of the vulgar and traditional concept of time. The time as within timeness arises from an essential kind of temporalization, of primordial temporality. This origin means that the time in which objectively present things come into being and pass away is a genuine phenomenon of time. It is not an externalization of a qualitative time into space, as Bergson's interpretation of time, which is ontologically completely indeterminate and insufficient, would have it. The elaboration of the temporality of Dasein as everydayness historicity, and within-timeness. First, gives uncluttered insight into the complexities of a primordial ontology of Dasein. As being in the world, Dasein exists factically together with beings encountered within the world. Thus the being of Dasein gets its comprehensive ontological transparency only in the horizon of the clarified being of beings unlike Dasein, that is, even of what is not at hand and not objectively present, but only subsists. But if the variations of being are to be interpreted for everything of which we say that it is, we need beforehand a sufficiently clarified idea of being in general. As long as we have not reached this, the repetition of the temporal analysis of Dasein will remain incomplete and marred by lack of clarity, to say nothing of the factual difficulty. The existential temporal analysis of Dasein requires in its turn a new repetition in the context of a fundamental discussion of the concept of being. Section 67. The basic content of the existential constitution of Dasein and the preliminary sketch of its temporal interpretation, our preparatory analysis, has made accessible a multiplicity of phenomena that must not be allowed to disappear from our phenomenological view, despite our concentration on the foundational structural wholeness of care. Far from excluding such a multiplicity, the primordial wholeness of the constitution of being of Dasein as articulated demands it. The primordiality of the constitution of Dasein does not coincide with the simplicity and uniqueness of an ultimate structural element. The ontological origin of the being of Dasein is not inferior to that which arises from it, but exceeds it in power from the beginning. Any arising in the field of ontology is degeneration. The ontological penetration to the origin does not arrive at things which are ontically self-evident for the common understanding. Rather, it is precisely this that opens up the questionability of everything self-evident. In order to bring the phenomena at which we arrived in our preparatory analysis back to a phenomenological view, a reference to the stages we have gone through will suffice. The delineation of care emerged from our analysis of the disclosedness that constitutes the being of the there. The clarification of this phenomenon signified that a preliminary interpretation of the basic constitution of Dasein of being in the world was necessary. Our inquiry began with a characterization of being in the world, and then went on to secure from the very beginning an adequate phenomenal horizon, as opposed to the inappropriate and typically unexpressed ontological predeterminations of Dasein. Being in the world was initially characterized with regard to the phenomenon of the world. Indeed, our explication moved from an ontic and ontological characterization of the things at hand and objectively present in the surrounding world to a delineation of innerworldliness, thus making the phenomenon of worldliness in general visible in innerworldliness. But the structure of worldliness, significance, turned out to be coupled with that upon which the understanding essentially belonging to disclosedness projects itself, that is, with the potentiality of being of Dasein for the sake of which it exists. The temporal interpretation of everyday Dasein must begin with the structures in which disclosedness constitutes itself. These are understanding, attunement, entanglement, and discourse. The modes of the temporalizing of temporality to be exposed with regard to these phenomena provide the basis for defining the temporality of being in the world. This leads again to the phenomenon of the world, and permits us to delineate the specifically temporal problematic of worldliness. It must be confirmed by characterizing the everyday being in the world closest to us by entangled, circumspect taking care of things. The temporality of taking care makes it possible for circumspection to be modified into a perceiving that looks at things, and the theoretical knowledge based on such perceiving. The temporality of being in the world that thus emerges at the same time turns out to be the foundation of the specific spatiality of Dasein. The temporal constitution of de-distancing and directionality must be shown. The whole of these analyses reveals a possibility of temporalizing of temporality in which the inauthenticity of Dasein is ontologically grounded, and leads to the question of how the temporal nature of everydayness, the temporal meaning of the initially, and for the most part, which we have continually been using, is to be understood. Fixing upon this problem makes clear that, and to what extent, the clarification of the phenomenon that we have so far attained is not sufficient. The present chapter thus has the following structure: the temporality of disclosedness in general, section 68, the temporality of being in the world and the problem of transcendence, section 69, the temporality of the spatiality commensurate with Dasein, section 70, the temporal meaning of the everydayness commensurate with Dasein, section 71,